All right, hello everyone. My name is Jason Kim, and I'll talk about our paper titled Checking Passwords on Leaky Computers, a side channel analysis of Chrome's password leak detection protocol. First, I'll discuss the motivation behind why Google has password leak detection built into Chrome. If an adversary compromises a user's password to one of their services, well, it's well known that people tend to reuse passwords across services. So the adversary can perform a credential stuffing attack where they try to use the same compromised password on other services. This leads to further compromise of the user's accounts at a notable rate because an estimated 6.9% of credentials are still valid on some service even after compromise. As a countermeasure to this, Google devised their own protocol, which they call password leak detection, and it's enabled by default. Whenever a user logs into a website, Chrome engages in a protocol with Google servers to determine if the password is part of Google's database of leaked passwords. If it is, Chrome shows a pop-up to the user urging them to change their password. While services that alert the user of compromised passwords are not unheard of, Google's protocol is notable in that it preserves privacy in both directions. That is, password leak detection assumes that both client and server may be malicious. And therefore, the server shouldn't know anything about the client's credentials. In addition, having a database of leaked passwords is amazing for a dictionary attack. So the client shouldn't know anything about the server's database either. To accomplish this, the protocol employs some cryptographic primitives that haven't seen as much scrutiny in hardware security as some others have seen. This brings us to the key question of our paper, which is password leak detection secure against side channel attacks? Obviously, the answer is no, and that's why I'm standing here today. But first, let me introduce Google's crazy protocol. To start with, none of us here are willing to give the server our password in plain text, right? So Chrome will take the user's password and hash it, which I'll represent with a hash brown. Here it uses scrypt, a memory hard hash function. This means the cost of running scrypt over and over again scales dominantly with RAM rather than CPU cycles. And it's also a countermeasure against brute forcing the hash function with custom ASICs. Second, to determine if the user's password is in Google's database of leaked passwords while preserving privacy, we need something called private set intersection, which I'll start introducing. I know this is a browser session, so sorry for straying into some cryptography. But we want the server to be able to perform computations on this hashed password, even when it's blinded, which I'll go into in a bit. To achieve this, Chrome will map the hash to a point on an elliptic curve, and for now, let's call that point Q. However, we still aren't willing to provide the server with that point in plain sight. So we will blind the point before sending it to the server. More specifically, Chrome, as the client, randomly generates a blinding factor, and let's call that A. Then it will perform blinding with some modular exponentiation by raising the point Q to the power of A. And that is what gets sent to the server. In turn, the server, without knowing anything about the password, can compute P, which contains information on whether the password was compromised or not. However, P is still blinded by that blinding factor A when it gets sent back to Chrome. This is what brings us to the last step, where Chrome will calculate the modular inverse of A, and will use that to unblind P from the server's response. And finally, at this point, Chrome can inspect P and arrive at a verdict for whether it should prompt the user to change the password or not. And for the rest of this talk, I'll focus on the three parts on the top half of the slide, namely scrypt, hash-to-curve, and modular inversion. Now that we've gone over this crazy protocol, we'll present three attacks under 3 different threat models. First, let's consider the simplest threat model of a native adversary, where the adversary's application and Chrome run on the same system and therefore the same CPU. In this scenario, we can go after scrypt. Here's a pseudocode of scrypt where we observe in red where it makes accesses into a big array in memory called V. We can visualize this as a heat map of V where the red elements have been accessed and the white elements have not been accessed. This access pattern is determined by the input to scrypt, namely the user's credentials. Now, forgive me for going off topic again in a browser session, but let me explain why this is problematic from a side channel perspective. To bridge the gap in latency between the CPU core and main memory, CPUs will store recently accessed data in small caches, thereby making access to them fast. For data that hasn't been accessed recently, however, they need to be loaded from main memory, which is slow. Armed with that knowledge, we can now have an adversary who sits and times the access to elements in the V array. So the red elements are quickly loaded from cache to the adversary, but the white elements are slowly loaded from main memory. And using this timing difference, the adversary is able to reconstruct a trace of that heat map on the top. This gives way to a dictionary attack, where we start with over 14 million real passwords from the famous Rocky breach. We run the scrypt function on each password to reconstruct a heat map trace, and we save into our dictionary pairs of password and trace. Accordingly, when we measure a trace of an unknown password, like the one the attacker recovered on the right, we can simply search each entry in the dictionary to find a match below. In the end, using 5 such measurements that take about 5 seconds total, we show that the adversary can guess the correct password on the very first attempt 80% of the time. Now, native adversaries are cool, but who runs untrusted binaries on their machine naively? Furthermore, I'd like to say this is becoming a bit deprecated, because nowadays we live in our web browsers, and all the services that we use on the daily, such as email, social media, and online banking, are all served over the browser. In response to that, we present our second threat model and attack. So let's move on to a browser adversary. This threat model is a lot more dangerous because all the target needs to do is have the adversary's web page open on one tab, and for example, their bank account login page open on another tab, all on the same machine. This time we'll go after Chrome's hash-to-curve algorithm, which we need for the server to be able to compute on data that is blinded. So to map the hash of the password, like the hash brown from earlier, to a point on a curve, we observe that the hash-to-curve pseudocode there iterates over a while loop. However, it will simply try mapping over and over again until it finds a point that's on the curve. Therefore, the number of iterations that while loop takes is input dependent. From before, you might see where this is going, namely that any secret-dependent program behavior is a red flag. In a similar manner to before, using the timing difference between cache and memory, we can determine how many times this loop executed. In this graph, for example, we observe a red timing spike whenever this loop runs. And therefore, we can measure the duration of how long we saw these spikes to determine how many iterations occurred. This lets us construct yet another dictionary, offline, where each entry consists of a pair of password and number of loop iterations. Compared to our native adversary from before, this dictionary provides a bit less uniquely identifying information per password. However, certain passwords like the one in red have a very high iteration count, which lets the adversary identify that password. We demonstrated this attack in the Chrome browser with the target browsing our web page in one tab and logging into another web page in a separate tab. Despite the JavaScript sandbox and tiered JIT compilation adding noise, we were able to retrieve some passwords with a 66% success rate after performing 5 measurements that took about 5 seconds in total. So far, we've been considering threat models where the adversary is co-located on the client's machine. But what if the adversary runs the server too? Recall that Google's password leak detection protocol guarantees via blinding that the server cannot see the client's hashed password. Our third attack will go after the unblinding part, which involves modular inversion. We show that if the adversary has native capabilities and runs the server, then they can violate Google's guarantee. I know, it's been a while since the protocol overview, so let's talk blinding again. So far, we're at a point where the user's password has been hashed and mapped to that point Q on the curve. We can't send Q to the potentially malicious server because everything so far has been deterministic, allowing for a dictionary attack. So we need to blind Q. Chrome, as the client, will randomly generate a blinding factor A, which the server shouldn't know about. Then we can send Q to the A to the server. The server, without knowing anything about the password, computes P, which contains information on whether the password was compromised or not. But P is still blinded by A when it gets sent back to Chrome. So for Chrome to see the result and make a decision, it needs to unblind it by computing the modular inverse of the blinding factor A. So far, there's a bunch of crypto running in the background of Chrome every single time you log in. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? However, the adversary has Q to the A because they run the server, right? Adding to that, unfortunately, Chrome uses the Binary Extended Euclidian Algorithm, or BEEA, when computing the modular inverse, which is not constant time. This leaks the modular inverse of the blinding factor A on the floor to a side channel adversary, which we also assume for this attack. So if the server has Q to the A that the client gave, and A inverse from a side channel trace, they're able to compute the point Q, which is deterministic for each password. And this is bad because the adversary can now build a dictionary that maps passwords to coordinates and eventually figure out what the client's password is. And indeed, we were able to recover the blinding factor and the password completely in just 34 milliseconds. So let's talk about the big picture now. We noticed that Chrome had a new protocol to check for credential stuffing attacks that used some new cryptography whose side channel resistance had not been studied well. So what's new? Well, we ended up breaking Chrome in 3 different places under 3 threat models. And in all attacks, the password leak detection protocol can disclose a user's password to the adversary. This happened because the algorithms were not input oblivious. This leaves traces in the CPU's cache, which is shared across security domains like process and web page boundaries. These traces can be measured by an adversary on the same system, like in native and browser environments. And by the way, if the adversary runs a server too, then the landscape is looking even worse. So we emphasize the need for constant time implementations in Chrome's password leak detection. More broadly, other browsers also have their own password leak detection schemes. So shout out to Microsoft Edge for implementing one with fully homomorphic encryption, and also to Apple's Safari for implementing a slightly different private set intersection mechanism. It is an open and exciting research question to reason: how side channel resilient are their implementations? And that brings an end to my talk. My name is Jason Kim. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.